In the middle of the night, in November 1807, they carried Maria I, Queen of Portugal, onto a ship. Carried her. She couldn't walk on her own. She didn't know where she was. She thought she was being kidnapped. And as the fleet pushed out into the Atlantic, fleeing Napoleon, fleeing everything, she screamed. For 3 months across an ocean, the Queen of Portugal screamed. And once, not so long before that night, she had been one of the most capable, most beloved monarchs in Europe. For Portugal, teetering between old power and emerging threats, she was more than just a figurehead. Maria held together an empire spanning continents, her steady rule seen by many as the last safeguard against collapse. The fate of colonies, trade, and thousands depended on her clarity and strength. So what happened? The easy answer is grief. She lost her husband, she lost her children, she lost her mind. Tragedy upon tragedy until something snapped. And that's the version most history books give you. But the real answer is older than Maria, darker than grief. And it starts not with what she lost, but with what was done to her bloodline before she was even born. Before we go any further, I want to put something in front of you, because it changes how you hear everything that comes after. When historians talk about Maria's mental collapse, it tends to be explained as the result of grief. She lost her husband, she lost her son, she lost her confessor. The losses piled up, the story goes, and eventually they broke her. And that's true as far as it goes. But here is what that version of the story leaves out. Maria's 2 unmarried sisters both developed strikingly similar mental conditions. Not the same triggers, not the same circumstances, the same condition. In their own time, the afflictions that marked the sisters were spoken of in the language of the 18th century. Melancholia, mania, religious excess, fits of agitation that baffled physicians and priests alike. They were not considered medical puzzles so much as warnings or personal tragedies, explained by grief or by vague notions of female weakness. Yet when researchers in the 21st century looked back at Maria's symptoms, the episodes, the delusions, the long stretches of crippling despair alternating with periods of vivid clarity and energy, they saw the outlines of something that modern medicine recognizes: bipolar disorder, a condition that carries a genetic inheritance rate of between 70 and 90%. In other words, the thing that destroyed Maria's mind may not have been grief alone. It may have been encoded into her from birth, written into her bloodline by generations of a royal family so consumed by the idea of keeping their blood pure that they had been quietly, systematically passing the same fragilities down the line for over a century. The system that was supposed to produce the strongest, most unassailable monarchs in Europe may have been the very thing that guaranteed her collapse. Keep that thought, because it sits at the heart of everything. To understand what was done to Maria, you have to go back further than her own birth. You have to look at the world her family had built and the price they had decided, quietly and collectively, was worth paying to maintain it. The royal houses of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Braganzas, had spent centuries treating marriage as a political instrument. You didn't marry for love, you barely married for compatibility. You were married to seal alliances, consolidate power, and keep wealth and titles inside a closed circle of approved families. The rules were written into the very contracts that joined these dynasties. A princess might arrive at court accompanied by an itemized dowry twice the size of her husband's annual revenue, while an archduke would sign away inheritance rights in exchange for a bride whose signature alone meant military or mercantile advantage. In 1715, for example, The marriage treaty between Philip V of Spain and Elizabeth Farnese specified not only a staggering sum in cash and jewels, but also the exchange of Italian duchies as chess pieces in the hands of their parents, the deal brokered in staterooms by emissaries instead of lovers. The smaller that circle became, the more those families intermarried, the more the same blood, the same genes, the same inherited vulnerabilities circulated through generation after generation. Maria's parents, King Joseph I of Portugal and Maria Anna of Spain, were the 16th Iberian royal couple to be joined by close intermarriage. The 16th. This was not a coincidence or an accident. It was policy. A deliberate, generational choice made by people who genuinely believed that keeping royal blood unmixed with common stock would produce stronger, more legitimate rulers. What it actually produced was the opposite. Mental illness, physical fragility, children who died before they should have, and a quiet, creeping damage that accumulated silently across the decades, invisible until it wasn't. Maria was born in 1734, the eldest child of King Joseph I. From the very beginning, she was being prepared for power, educated, shaped, and formed in the intensely religious atmosphere of the Portuguese court. She was devout in a way that went beyond convention. For Maria, faith was not a performance of piety, it was the lens through which she understood everything. God was present in every decision, every loss, every moment of her life. That faith would sustain her for decades, and later, it would devastate her. In 1760, Maria married Peter, Duke of Beja. Peter was her uncle, her father's younger brother. The marriage was arranged specifically to keep the family name intact, a deliberate, calculated decision that prioritized the Braganza bloodline above any concern for what the union might mean biologically or personally. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, not for shock value, though it is shocking by any modern standard, but because it illustrates with perfect clarity the logic of the system Maria was born into. The people making this decision were not monsters. They were operating entirely within the norms of their time and class, and that, in its own way, makes it more troubling. Not a single person in that room appears to have questioned it. By most historical accounts, the marriage was actually a reasonably content one. Peter, now styled King Peter III when Maria ascended the throne, was a gentler, less politically ambitious man than many of the kings around him. He supported Maria. He did not overshadow her. And Maria, who loved deeply and loyally, appears to have genuinely cared for him. They had 6 children together. But the genetic weight of that union, uncle and niece, in a bloodline already thick with close marriages, almost certainly left its mark. Half of those 6 children did not survive. Half. 3 children gone. In an era before modern medicine, infant mortality was common enough that it could be absorbed, rationalized, grieved, and moved past. But for Maria, with her profound faith and her acute sense of divine meaning in all things, every death was not simply a loss. It was a message, a judgment, a signal from God that something somewhere was deeply wrong. Before we reach the collapse of Maria's reign, there is a moment in her childhood that cannot be overlooked because it shaped the psychological landscape she carried into adulthood, long before the grief and the illness arrived. On the morning of the 1st of November 1755, the city of Lisbon was destroyed. The earthquake that struck that morning was one of the most powerful ever recorded in European history. It lasted somewhere between 3 and 6 minutes. When it stopped, fires broke out across the city. Then a tsunami rolled in from the Atlantic. By the time it was over, somewhere between 10,000 and 60,000 people were dead. The estimates vary wildly, because there was so little left to count. One contemporary account by the British envoy in Lisbon, Henry Fielding, described a city reduced to ashes and a population unnumbered. So many were swept away or vanished without trace. An official Portuguese government inquiry estimated that nearly a quarter of Lisbon's inhabitants perished, and entire parishes simply ceased to exist in civic records. Lisbon, one of the great capitals of Europe, was reduced to rubble. The royal family survived only by chance. They had left the city that morning at the request of one of the king's daughters, who had wanted to spend the holy day, All Saints' Day, at a palace outside the city. That decision saved their lives. Maria was 21 years old. She watched her city burn from a distance. Her father, King Joseph, never fully recovered. He developed such a severe fear of enclosed spaces that he refused to sleep indoors for the rest of his life, living instead in a series of elaborate tented pavilions on the palace grounds. The trauma was visible, physical, and undeniable. For Maria, the earthquake did something different. It deepened an already profound sense that God's hand was present in the world, that suffering had meaning, that disaster was divine communication. In the trembling aftermath, she clung to lines she would carry for the rest of her life. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That belief would sustain her through extraordinary difficulty. Much later, in the lonely shadows of her unraveling, those same words would echo back at her, twisted and charged with accusation. It was a belief that, when the losses came thick and fast, it would turn inward and become something far darker. Maria became Queen of Portugal in 1777 upon the death of her father, Joseph I. She was 42, and she assumed the throne with a clarity of purpose that surprised those who had perhaps underestimated her. One of her first acts was to dismiss the Marquis of Pombal, the powerful, ruthless minister who had dominated her father's court for decades. Pombal was brilliant and had overseen the rebuilding of Lisbon after the earthquake with remarkable efficiency. He was also autocratic, feared, and had accumulated enemies in every corner of Portuguese society. Maria dismissed him within weeks of taking the throne and had him investigated for abuses of power. The action was decisive and popular. It signaled immediately that this queen intended to rule, not merely to reign. She was known for her accessibility. She met with ordinary petitioners, attended public ceremonies, and was visible in a way that Portuguese monarchs had not always been. She was called Maria the Pious, and the name was not ironic. Her faith was genuine, and her people knew it. For a time, Maria I's reign was a genuinely hopeful chapter in Portuguese history. But the losses were already gathering. In 1786, her husband Peter died. Maria's grief was deep and genuine, but she held. She continued to govern. She continued to function. Whatever was coming had not yet arrived. Then, in 1788, her eldest son and heir, José, died of smallpox. He was 27 years old. This loss was of a different order entirely. And the reason it was different, the reason it carved something out of Maria that never healed, was this. She had opposed smallpox inoculation on religious grounds. The technology existed, the option had been available, and Maria, guided by her faith and her deep suspicion of interfering with God's design, had refused it. Her son died of a disease she believed, in some corner of herself, she could have prevented. That is not a grief that resolves. That is a grief that becomes something else entirely. A guilt so heavy and so airless that it begins to reshape the mind around it. For a woman whose faith had always told her that suffering carried meaning, the unbearable question was now impossible to escape. What did this mean? What was God telling her? What had she done, or failed to do, that had brought this down on her family? Shortly after, her daughter also died of smallpox. Then her confessor, the spiritual advisor she had relied on for years, died as well. The world Maria had built her stability on was dismantling itself, piece by piece. By 1792, Maria I was no longer able to govern. The deterioration had been gradual, then sudden, the way these things often go. There had been signs for years, episodes of extreme agitation, periods of withdrawal, a growing terror that seemed to have no single source. But by 1792, what had once been episodes had become a permanent state. The palace walls where she spent her confinement were thick and cold, their stones sweating in the damp Portuguese winter, and the small rooms were saturated with the sharp scent of vinegar and crushed herbs favoured by her doctors. Maria passed long hours in bedsheets stiff with starch, her wrists sometimes bound with linen bands, while the murmur of prayers and the faint medicinal aroma of willow bark hung in the air. Behind the doors, physicians whispered about humours, salts, and the virtues of restraint, their world lit dimly by smoky oil lamps that left shadows crawling across the floor. In those rooms, medicine felt less like science and more like ritual. The limits of what could be done were written into the walls themselves. Visitors to the palace reported hearing screaming through the walls, not ordinary distress screaming that was described in vivid and horrifying terms, visions of damnation. Maria believed she was condemned. She believed she could see hell. She spoke of demons. Her language, always so careful and so devout, became shocking in its rawness. People who had known her for decades stood outside her door, not recognizing the voice coming from within. The physicians who treated her included Francis Willis, the same English doctor who had treated King George III of Britain during his own breakdown. Willis's methods were harsh by any standard: restraints, isolation, and cold water treatments. Whether they helped Maria is deeply uncertain. What they tell us is that the medical understanding of mental illness in the 18th century was not equipped to help someone like her. The tools available were blunt, and the theories underpinning them were wrong. Her son João, the future King João VI, assumed the role of Prince Regent in 1799, effectively taking over the country's governance. Maria remained queen in name. In practice, she was no longer present in any meaningful sense. In November 1807, Napoleon's forces entered Portugal. The court had no choice but to flee, and the destination was Brazil, Portugal's vast colony across the Atlantic. The entire royal family, thousands of courtiers, and whatever valuables could be loaded in time were packed onto a fleet of ships and sent out into the Atlantic in the middle of the night. Maria had to be carried on board. She didn't understand what was happening. She screamed that she was being kidnapped. She was placed below deck, and the ship sailed, and she screamed for much of the 3 months it took to cross the ocean. Think about what that crossing must have been like. A fleet of ships, carrying an entire displaced court, sailing through the Atlantic in winter, and somewhere below deck, the sounds of their queen, the woman who had once stood before her people as a symbol of strength and continuity, completely and utterly lost. Maria lived in Brazil for the rest of her life. She never returned to Portugal. She died in Rio de Janeiro in 1816, at the age of 81, having spent nearly the last quarter of her life in a state of severe mental illness, largely removed from the world around her. She had been queen for 15 years before the collapse came. She had another 24 years after it. Most of those years were, by any account, a form of quiet suffering. History tends to remember Maria I in one of two ways: either as a tragic figure, undone by grief, a victim of circumstance, or as a cautionary footnote in the long story of European royal decline. Either way, she tends to be defined by her illness rather than by everything that came before it. That feels wrong to me. And I think it's worth taking a moment to push back. Maria was the first queen regnant of Portugal. She ruled for 15 years with genuine capability and real popular support. She checked the power of an autocratic minister within weeks of taking the throne. She was accessible to her people in ways that many monarchs simply were not. Before the losses came, before the grief and the guilt and the illness arrived, she was, by most accounts, a good queen. That part of her story tends to get swallowed by the part that came after. But the deeper thing, the thing that I find myself sitting with, is not about Maria specifically. It's about the system that produced her. For centuries, the royal families of Europe told themselves a story. The story was about purity, about the importance of keeping royal blood unmixed, uncontaminated, and protected from the outside world. It was a story about strength, about producing rulers who were inherently, biologically superior to the people they governed. What they actually produced was generation after generation of people carrying inherited vulnerabilities they had no language to understand and no means to address. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Braganzas, the same pattern repeated across courts and centuries: mental illness, physical fragility, children who died too young, rulers who collapsed under the weight of thrones they were not biologically equipped to carry. Maria did not fail her crown. The system that was built to fail her long before she was born, in the decisions made by people who would never live to see the consequences. She inherited a bloodline already compromised, a faith already primed to turn grief into guilt, and a world that offered her no framework for understanding what was happening to her mind. She screamed in the dark on a ship crossing the Atlantic, and nobody could explain why. Not to her, not to themselves. The medicine didn't exist. The understanding didn't exist. All they could do was sail on, and she screamed. If this story stayed with you, if you want more of the history that doesn't get told the way it deserves, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Women who were shaped and broken and forgotten by systems that never paused to consider the cost. They deserve better than footnotes, and so do you.